All right. So usually we're going to do, well, usually I'll lecture and in person, and that way you guys can ask me questions and whatnot. But this is kind of like we're getting going on a project, and so we're going to do inverse. But if you have any questions, write them down, and then when I come back in the room, you can ask any questions that you need, and we can kind of sort them out. Although I'm going to get one room going on the project so that we can kind of get the ball rolling because we hit the ground really quickly. But without further ado, today's lecture is going to be, oops, where'd you go? There we go. On gestalt and grounds. And so what is gestalt? Gestalt psychology Gestalt psychology is a school of psychology that was founded in the 20th century that provides the foundation for modern study of perception. Gestalt theory emphasizes that the whole of anything is greater than its parts. That is, the attributes of the whole are not deduced from analyzation of the parts in isolation. The word gestalt is used in modern German to mean the way things have been placed or put together. There is no exact equivalent for this in English. Form, shape are usually translated in psychology. The words are often interpreted as pattern or configuration. So what does that all mean? Well, let's simplify that whole little history block down a little bit further. Gestalt is a psychological term that theorizes that people tend to organize visual elements into groups and unify them as a whole. So I want you all to close your eyes a little bit and do a little bit of imagination with me. I want you to imagine a tree. Okay, we have that in our heads? Cool. And so when I said or asked you to visualize a tree, there was probably a big trunk, and there were some branches, and there were some leaves on the branches. And we know these are all the parts that make up a tree, but we unify all the parts to see the tree first. And so when we look at a tree, now there are specific examples. There are people that do see this in reverse, where they do find the leaf and whatnot. Those are case-by-case individual special examples. But generally, when we see the tree, we say, oh, that's a tree. Oh, there are some branches. Oh, look at those beautiful leaves. Like usually we work down to the smallest parts. And so that's kind of what Gestalt psychology is. Now, we can apply this. Why won't you let me see? There we go. We can apply this in some general rules, and we'll break this down even further into specific types of Gestalt. So some general rules: objects will be perceived in their simplest form. Humans naturally flow through curves or lines, so we tend to follow them. And the mind will attempt to imply details that aren't actually there. We like to fulfill things. And so the very first thing is we see these, this Olympic symbol down here. Where'd my mouse go? I don't know where my mouse is. Okay, well, if we look down at the bottom left, we see the Olympic rings, and we know that they're rings. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 Olympic rings. Learning something new every day. I did not know. I thought there were 6. But we know that these are circles, but if we look specifically at them, they're actually not circles. So we can see that the blue is intersected and kind of makes, not a Venn diagram, where the circles intersect. So it's not a complete circle, but we want to see it as that. And so we start to break these parts down. Or if we break it all the way down, we don't actually, what's being represented is actually segments, but we see them as a whole, and we say, oh, they're unified, 5 unified rings. Okay, So that kind of covers objects will be perceived in their simplest forms. Humans naturally flow, or our eyes tend to follow lines or curves. So if we go over to this traffic circle example, we want to follow, so there's lots of ways into that circle, but we want to keep following that circle. Our eye tracks around it and then exits. We like that. Sharp corners tend to be jarring for our mind, and they tend to make us stop. So 90-degree corners tend to make your eye stop, whereas nice linear, curvular corners are very nice ways to make our eye flow. And we can use this in compositions or in design to help emphasize points, or to create, to help our viewer's eye flow through the artwork and stop where we want it to stop and move where we want to move. If we want to make a very energetic composition, we'll have a lot of curved lines that bisect or intersect. Whereas if we want to make a very jarring, aggressive feeling composition, you have lots of sharp, acute angles that, you know, don't really meet, and there's not a lot of bisection or intersection of those shapes or lines. Finally, the mind will attempt to imply detail that isn't actually there. So if we look at the bottom right, WWF, World Wildlife Fund, and their symbol is a panda. Well, it's not really a panda. Like if we break it down, it's kind of a swooshy shape in the back that is bisected by this kind of, I don't know, like scrunched C. And then there's like some like dots randomly placed. But we want to imply that that thinning curve off the back leg continues up and makes the line that connects to the back, that makes the back of the panda. That's a panda, right? Yeah, it's a panda. And we want to imply that. And so we will imply things or details to make unified wholes. Our minds like puzzles, and we like to solve puzzles. It's, and so if you want to imply something, you can, and our mind will complete it. Okay, so if we actually backtrack, we can look at closure, proximity, continuity, continuation, similarity, and grounds, and figures and grounds. And those kind of make up the general rule of Gestalt theories. And so we'll kind of move forward and go through them one at a time. So continuation. Continuation occurs when the eye is compelled to move through one object and continue to another object. My favorite of these examples is the Amazon, right? Amazon has this little smile arrow if we go down to the Amazon block. And it actually, so not only does it make a little smile, but it points from A to Z. It implies that they have everything from A to Z. They can get you there. And it moves you through that. It bumps you right through that. Another really good example is the USA Network, right? There is no physical outline to the S. The S does not actually exist in USA Network. But we can see that it's implied there. And so our minds make that S exist. And so we can continue through. Finally, in ProQuest, I think it's the serif is what it's called, or the dash and the Q makes a little path that tells you that your journey starts here and that you will learn and go through the portal that is the body of the Q, the O section of the Q. And that's continuation. Each one of these is implying some level of movement through the design. Okay. If you have any questions about that, write them down, and hopefully we can answer them when I get back. Okay, closure. Closures are really fun, and lots of artists take advantage of closure. Closure occurs when an element is incomplete or a space is not totally enclosed. If enough of a shape is indicated or hinted at, the viewer will subconsciously fill in the missing. Sometimes we imply line. We'll talk about that when we get into chapter 1 a little bit more. But here we're implying form or shape through this. And so we already really kind of covered the WWF, although it is a good example. It's fairly familiar. This Dalmatian is a really good example of closure as well, especially up in the face and the upper body. We can take all these spots, and even though there's no line that continues it, we know this outline exists. I think the design gets a little weak on the back end. The back leg kind of disappears into nothing and gets a little spotty. Similarity occurs when objects look similar to one another. The viewer will perceive them as a group or a pattern. These similarities can be color, texture, value, or other fundamental principles, rhythm, line, just anything that looks the same or comes close to it. And so the differences in the MBC peacock tail are they're all different colors, but their similarity is they're all the same shape. And while not unified in any way or joined in any way, we read them as a whole because we know what a peacock is. So it's a little bit of recognition or a little bit of closure, but it's also a lot of similarity built into it. We read it as the peacock tail. There's a little bit of closure here with also, I really wish I could have my mouse. Why can't I have my mouse? I don't know. Anyway, there's a little bit of closure here in the purple vein, or the purple like tear shape has that little, and that implies the beak of the peacock, and we're implying it. Okay, so we can break similarity with anomalies. This is when we change something or make it unexpected. When objects are similar, another object can be emphasized if it is different or if it's fundamentally changed from the rest. So here I've used scale. Come on, there we go. Here I've used scale to change this pattern of bricks. We're implying that these bricks make a cube because they're all similar. But instead of the expected, I give you the unexpected at the bottom right-hand corner with scale, with the size of it. And so it kind of becomes a focal point. It draws you in to that bottom corner. In design, maybe your client wants something very rigid and steady. And so you make a similarity across using these squares, and then you want to emphasize their logo, and so you put it as a cutout in the bottom brick or the bottom cube. In art, these anomalies often become focal points in and of themselves, or rest bits for the eye. If you have a very active canvas and you have one line that's super weighted, really thick, like a 5-inch line that comes through the canvas, your eye's going to pause on that. It's going to be a break, depending on how much activity you have. If you have a very active canvas in the background, that line will move forward and it becomes a break. Okay, proximity, and I need to move me. I'm in the way of my example. There we go. Proximity. Proximity occurs when elements are placed close enough to each other that they read as a whole. The position of these elements help portray a relationship between these separate parts. The opposite is also true. So we can have proximity. Adidas has great proximity. We read this as the mountain, or apparently, and I didn't know this, it's actually supposed to read as an ancient Greek slipper, or not slipper, but sandal. I don't know that. But those lines read as a whole. They make a big triangle from these little rectangles on the side because of their proximity. Now, if we break that proximity, then we can emphasize the space in between. I think 3 is kind of the beginning example of this, but really, if you wanted to do this with greater effect, like the more you can give your viewer, the better that will be emphasized. So if we go below Adidas, we can see that I've used some parallelograms, some squished squares, to mimic the Adidas logo, but I have changed their orientation and broken their proximity to each other, thus creating an anomaly on the back end where we're emphasizing that bigger one. It's a little bit further away. It breaks that pattern. I think with more lines, that would become more apparent and be more fluid visually. Symmetry. We're going to talk a lot about symmetry when we get to chapter principles, are chapter 3, because it is a basic principle. Well, balance is a basic principle of art, which incorporates symmetry and the many types of symmetry that exist in the world. Symmetry, though, are elements that are symmetrical to each other, tend to be perceived as a unified group, or elements that have equal weight from each side tend to be viewed as a whole. So the McDonald's sign is this very symmetrical arch that then bumps out and makes a second arch. It also makes an M, which is pretty handy because McDonald's. And we can see from the example that if we break that, it becomes, it becomes a little disjointed because we know that it's supposed to be together, but it also doesn't feel as unified. Now, a fun fact, second fun fact for today, I believe it's in Thailand, they actually break the arch, so it's double arches. And so we have a Western symbol, McDonald's symbol here, or logo, and then we have the Thailand specific double arched logo in the same red box. Now, let's move over to everyone's favorite coffee shop. Well, maybe not everyone's favorite coffee shop. Maybe you support local coffee. Good for you for supporting local coffee. But a major coffee shop that we know exists to the Starbucks. And this is a very symmetrical design. In fact, it's implied symmetry because it continues shapes through its axes. And yeah, it's symmetrical. Okay, figure grounds. This is a pretty fun one. The human eye differentiates an object from its surrounding area. A form or shape is perceived as a figure, while the surrounding area is perceived as a ground. You can play with this, with balancing this. And come on, I just need to move me. There we go. Now, come on. There we go. And so if we move up to, I believe this is the cover of, it's a cover of a Batman symbol book. And I can't remember which one. Criminal Underland, maybe. It's a little blurry, but we can see the figure is Batman, and he's a black silhouette in front of the moon, which is yellow. That becomes the ground. But if we flip the comic 180, then you get the outline of Batman's, well, maybe not Batman's nemesis, but one of Batman's villains, the Penguin. And we, if you're not familiar with Batman and the comic books, the Penguin has a big hooked nose, which is kind of the major characteristic. And he has kind of Spock hands. He has like little flippery hands with thumbs. He doesn't have like 4 fingers. which is just kind of his like default. And so the horns or the spikes on the bat helmet make up one of his hands. And so in the bottom example for the I think the Cincinnati Zoo, might be wrong. I think actually no, it's the Philadelphia Zoo. We can see that the ground is the white. So that's kind of the background, and coming forward from that is the black tree. But if we reverse those roles and we make the black tree the ground, then we have the outline of a gorilla that's being fascinated by this lioness, and this lioness that's, I don't know, kind of looking grouchily at the gorilla. It's kind of maybe a stare down between two apex predators. I don't know. But this can be really fun to play with. We can really really start to entangle the viewer in your composition with the more ground figure relationships that you play with. Now, you don't have to play with them like this in art. Okay, so then there, okay, then moving over there. So to break this down into a little bit more of a basic vocab definition, the figure/ground relationship can either be stable or unstable, depending on how easy it is to determine which is which. The classic example of these relationships is unstable, is the left image, right? And so the left image, it's either a vase or a face. We actually just looked through two examples of unstable grounds, right? Because we have two images, they're dual images in each of those relationships. I would say that the zoo logo is a little bit more stable because the tree is very emphasized. You can either see the vase or the two faces. So on the left-hand example is the vase and the two faces. We already covered that. Depending on which you see, depending on whether you see the black color as the figure or the white as the ground, or vice versa, that you can easily bounce back and forth between the two perceptions demonstrating the unstable relationship. Now, we can also use weight. Weight most oftenly dictates what grounds. The heavier the color, the further it tends to sink back, whereas the lighter the color, it kind of comes forward. And so in the example of black and white, the white rectangle feels, I guess it depends on how you look at it. Again, it's a little bit, comes down to you, but the white rectangle in this example feels like it's coming forward from the ground. Whereas if we inverse that and make the ground white in the black rectangle, it feels like it's pushing back. So we can kind of start to play with space as well on the 2D plane, which is pretty cool. We'll get really into that in chapter 4 when we talk about the illusions of both space and motion. This is kind of just a classic example. Do you see the duck? Do you see the rabbit playing with the ground? Okay, let's look at some artists. This is MC Escher. He's really popular. He's kind of the classic example of playing with viewers' perception within his artwork. Let's move me. There we go. And so in each of these cases, there are 3 stages to be distinguished. The first stage is, well, really to the example, well, both of these work really well for this. Okay. The first stage is the reverse of the final stage. That is white objects on black background against an black object on a white background. So Escher's taking us all the way through an entire figure ground reversal process in a single composition. And this really plays with the balance of the composition. The second stage is an intermediary stage between the two and is the true complete division of the plane in which the opposing elements are equal. And so to break this out a little bit further, if we look, well, you can look on the left or on the right. Let's go with the right first because it's horizontal, and left and right is easy. We're starting out on the left-hand side of the composition, of the right-hand composition, with these kind of fish swimming in a black background. And then as we kind of move right across the canvas, we begin to see details emerge from the black background, and it becomes an interlace between the amount of details, and both fish colors are fully pulled and fleshed out. And then as we move further right, the white fish kind of lose their detail, and that black fish come up off that white background. And so we're really using detail to define what is in what's relationship. The same is true with the left-hand picture, although it's a little bit more complex because not only is it, I'm going to use the word transfiguring a triangle into a swan, but it's also moving through a gradient of figure-ground relationships where you're starting at pretty equal, or you're starting at a black background with, you're starting with a white background with black objects or figures, moving into that intermix of equal distribution into a white background with black objects. And then also he's playing with scale and transfiguring the triangles into fully fleshed out birds. And so it gets a little bit more complex, but we like those puzzles. The more complex you can make the really simple puzzle visually very complex, and our minds love it. Okay. Basically, according to gestalt theory, the whole is different from its parts, which is kind of inverted from how we want to see it, because we want to see it as the parts. Wait, the whole is, crap, I'm gonna have to record this slide. Basically, according to gestalt theory, the whole is different from some of its parts. So we want to see the whole, and then we break down to the parts, and we can play with that. We can imply things through that relationship with art. Now, oh yeah, how can we, what we just learned to our composition, since I'm not in the room, well, we have one final, we have the end slide, which is now it's time for something completely different. Little Monty Python reference, start things off kind of light. So if one of you, if you're in the group that got the lecture first, if one of you can run around and grab me, or just let me know, and you might be going on break, or we might have timed this just right, and I'll come over and start you off on your project while the second group gets going. If you're on the second group that's already gotten the lecture, get back to work. But also somebody run around if I haven't come back in and tell me that you're done with the slideshow. Cool. Stop record. No, apparently not. Okay, take two.